Hi, my name is Ashish Chaturvedi. I'm a Director of Forensic Advisory at Grant Thornton in Thailand. Today, I'm very delighted to have my colleagues Belinda Tan and Wallace Lee from our Grant Thornton in Singapore office. Before we dive into our today's topic, which is around creating awareness about fraud, let me ask my colleagues to introduce themselves. Belinda, over to you.
Hi Ashish, it's great to be here. I'm very excited. Haven't been back to Bangkok for a while. And I look after our forensic team in Singapore. And with me today is Wallace.
Thank you, Ashish, for having us here today. My name is Wallace, and I'm an Associate Director at Grant Thornton in Singapore.
When we kickstart the series around creating an awareness of fraud in the Thailand market, I think it's very essential to find out how fraud has evolved over the years. And there'll be no better person than Belinda Tan amongst the three of us to talk about this, because she has seen from industry to industry, from geographies to geographies, as she has experience of working around different countries. So Bel, over to you. How do you think fraud has evolved since the time you started working and now that you're a leader of a forensic practice for the whole region?
You're making me sound really old, Ashish. I would say, fraud has evolved at least in the last 20 plus years from basic things like hard copies documents, when we were examining hard copies documents, to people submitting dual claims and all that, to now going paperless on the pretext that it's being environmental friendly, but also making our life a little bit more complicated than usual. And also the change in the personalities and the education and the sophistication of personalities and human beings involved. I would say that the culture piece plays quite a big role in this, in terms of from country to country, how the fraud profile might differ. We're also talking about the creativity of individuals, ranging from burning documents, physically destroying them, to destroying them on the computers, like we can all relate to. But at the end of the day, I think fraud is still fraud, big or small. And like what Warren Buffett has been talking about, when the tide goes out, we will know who has been swimming naked. And it still comes back to the fundamentals of why fraud is perpetrated. And it still has these three major points of consideration, which we call the fraud triangle as we talk about it. First and foremost would be the opportunities. I've been in the job for a very long time. I'm very familiar with the system. Therefore, I am able to spot the loopholes and find the opportunities to then be able to perpetrate the fraud. The second point would be rationalization. The last bit is I look at my neighbors and they're driving a Ferrari and I'm thinking, why am I not entitled to it? And I rationalize and I say, okay, if the person has it, why can't I have it too? So I call that rationalization. And finally, pressure to perform, especially in our current economic climate where we've got recession, we've got inflation, people losing their jobs. There is a lot of pressure to then say, I need to massage my numbers. I need to go and look at whether if the company is doing well. My management team is looking at me saying that, am I meeting my numbers? The sales guys are saying that, am I meeting my targets? So there's this absolute pressure on them to say, I need to make sure that I'm reporting the correct numbers. Yeah. So on that note, maybe Wallace, you can talk about how has clients actually come to us to then say, what are the points that they have to pay attention to?
Yes, thank you, Belle. And I think when companies come to look for us, most of the time there are suspicions around certain areas. But what I like everyone to know is that there is no one indicator that can determine that fraud exists or not.
Absolutely.
Most of the time, it is made up or consists of several indicators. And I like to bucket them into two areas. The first is the financial and the accounting perspective. And the second bucket is on human behavioral red flags. So going back to financial and accounting perspective, there are lots of indicators, and I'll talk about some of the key ones. The first is looking at fluctuations in certain key financial ratios and metrics. It is very common that management or senior managers start analyzing their financial performance across a period of time. And when things are rosy, when things are good, people don't suspect much. For example, your revenue has increased significantly. So it is a good thing to everyone in a company. However, if you were to look at it with a pair of forensic lenses, you may be then asking, how sure are we that these revenue are real? Now, this is particularly important when you see the rest of your peers in the industries that are not performing well, yet you are doing so good. So I think this is an indication. As I mentioned earlier, not one indication determines whether there's fraud. So some of the other key indicators that we look at is when there are unexplained transactions or write-offs happening in the company. So when there is a lack of details, when things are very vague, it sends a alert to us. Should we then be probing further? We as forensic investigators, we have a very inquisitive mindset approach towards things. So the more someone tries to hide things or be defensive against us, the more we would like to find out what exactly is causing it. What is the reason behind this? And I think that sums up some of the key points that we look into when it comes to fraud indicators.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned a very valid point. You're looking at the data and you see that rosy picture that I am doing well, but I'm not, I'm just being so centric about my business. I'm not looking out to the external environment, that my other contemporaries are not performing in the same manner. And I would say majority of the companies, and let's take specific examples in terms of industry. Look at consumer products. Look at e-commerce. Now they consume the data for consumer behavior. They do it for financial numbers. They do it for their cash flows because it's a heavy PE funded industry, right? They consume the same amount of data for their projections, but they forget that this data itself can throw you indicators about whether the company is in a sound financial condition or not, or there are indicators of fraud. So I think that's a very valid point. Just to make you aware about what we are seeing in Thailand, I think there have been some instances of frauds being reported, and they have caught the limelight of the media as well. I think this is about some numbers being cooked up, like the rosy picture which Wallace talked about, or meeting the number target for, let's say, key chief financial officers and other people on those lines. Now, when you meet these numbers, obviously you got to have a customer through which you sell, right? You got to have a supplier to supply that raw material. Now, in these circumstances, the recent cases, what we have seen is these are fictitious vendors or fictitious entities. So what about, vendor onboarding process or customer onboarding process? Who is doing the due diligence, right? Then once they're onboarded, you are generating a purchase order for the vendor. You are, taking the purchase order from the customers to generate a sales order, right? So who's doing that onboarding activity? So the corporate governance is a big risk and a big loss here. Further, it just doesn't stop here. You have to look forward. Now you're doing a transaction with them, right? In absence of any, goods or services being provided, you're doing a transaction with them, being provided or received. In case of vendors, right? You're doing a transaction with them, and then you finally receive a payment or make a payment, based on the nature of your relationship. So one person cannot do it when you talk about large entities, right? And then obviously the key person would be passing on these instructions to the people who have to act on it, who have to book the invoice or to crunch the numbers. Now, what get missed out is this person is doing it blindly just because, his boss has said or his senior has said, and then they are either scared or they say, it's not my business to report. I'm just doing my job. My boss instructed me to do it, and I did it. But at the end of the day, the public is at loss because the stock exchange does reflect when these things go out. So Bel, since you have worked in many geographies, how does it play out in terms of cultural aspect? How important it is to break these barriers around, you are my boss and I don't want to report it against you, right? What is the larger, what is the, who's the biggest loser here? Obviously, public being one, if you talk about public listed companies, but what goes behind is, can you talk about in terms of culture and how should organizations look at it?
I think it's not just if your company is listed, then obviously there's public interest involved.
Right.
In most instances that you and I are aware of, a lot of the companies are not listed. And so it's at the expense of the stakeholders and the shareholders. And lo and behold, sometimes it's actually the people charged with duties who are perpetrating the fraud. And you have got a situation where, for instance, let's say we do an investment and you've given me the authority to act and look after the company, and I'm the person charged with authority. And it's because of the trust and the faith, and you said, okay, Belle will be able to run this business successfully. And then I decided I was going to help myself to the cookie jar. And I said, 20 cents for me, 50 cents for you, 30 cents for me, 25 cents for you. And that sort of thing happens. And I think the longer this thing is not undetected, the average fraud goes undetected for a year and a half. And the average mean of loss at the moment reported in Asia is about $112,000.
US dollars.
So we're talking about this, and can you imagine if I'm doing this piece where when I'm doing this slowly, I'm creaming it off, it goes undetected. It would be at the loss of your investment. Obviously, I'm thickening my own pocket.
Right.
But it's also sending this message to the other people who start to detect, because time will tell. And people will be saying that, one, what's the management doing about it? Two, some people start to detect, and I may be roping Wallace in as part of the scheme, and there'll be collusion, which makes matters even worse. Sometimes it gets even worse when I go and ask my vendors for kickback, and then it permeates. Can you imagine that it actually permeates through this organization, and then the tone at the top gets affected, and then it's not just lost financially, but it's also the other aspect of it that comes along, like what you say about the culture, which makes me then worry about how do I go to sleep peacefully at night.
That's a very nice explanation, Belle. And I would say, when you were quoting the numbers, when you're quoting the period, I think it's for the audience to realize that the longer they keep it at bay, the higher the losses will be, right? Exactly. But in the instance, and Wallace, you have done some investigations like these. When the management is the one who has perpetrated the fraud, where do these employees go, and how do they, seek respite, and where do they seek respite?
I hope that these don't happen all the time, but you are absolutely right. There are instances where management is involved in the fraud, and you as an employee saw that. So what should you do? You, as first port of call, you would go up to the board of directors.
Okay.
You would go up to the audit committee. And if the situation is sensitive, you can't do this in person. What you can potentially do is to write in an anonymous letter to the relevant party. And for some companies who have a ethics or whistleblower hotline, use that. That would ensure that all complaints and feedback will be taken care of by the appropriate department and be seen by the highest authority. So that happens in a company, right? There are also situations where management found that employee is conducting the fraud. So what should management do? For most companies, you may consult your legal counsels,
Right.
because there may be civil and criminal implications which the lawyers will be better positioned to advise.
Mhm.
And when the allegations or the matter is less serious, company or may then consider conducting their own internal investigations. However, if the matter is serious, what we advise companies to do is to look for external help, to get in the professional forensic investigators to look into this matter, because there may be a situation where the alleged fraud is not just happening within the country domestically, but it also happens throughout the rest of the territories where the company is operating in. And by getting external help, you ensure that the investigation is being conducted seamlessly across these jurisdictions, and you get a complete picture of what actually happened.
Yeah. And then to add on to the point, if should you then want to preserve the company's rights and obligation, doing the investigation would then be preserving the evidence to ensure that you don't break the chain of custody,
Right.
and that in the event that you decide that you want to pursue or run after the naughty boy or naughty girl, or report to the authorities for all that matter, at least you will have all the evidence that you need for that.
Absolutely. And it is not specific to manual documents or electronic documents. You should approach it in a very holistic manner. And I think what Bell is mentioning is it's for the essence of for the audience, I think, is that information once destructed can lead you into varied paths if you're leading an investigation, right? So what happens is if you have those evidences preserved, the investigators are focused towards the right direction and they are able to come to a conclusion or a fact-finding report within a right amount of time. If you have half-baked evidence from the start, it may take a lot of time for the investigators to stitch the story back together. I think that's very essential. Yeah, reaching out for external help is very important. Majority of the organizations do not have technical capabilities to say when we talk about digital forensic procedures, or do not have the manpower because people are busy with the business as usual processes and their responsibilities and roles. So yes, it is very important. But yeah, so on that note, I would like to draw it on a close. Thank you so much, Bell, and thank you so much, Wallace, for joining this discussion with me in the studio. And let's do some more topics. Let's keep the discussion live as we go along. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.